I'd love to dive into your worldview. Kind of, we can, yeah. I mean, we've been talking about it tangentially, but I'd love to kind of build it up from scratch. And so, you've described it as naturalistic monism, and I think I also share the view of being someone who is aligns with naturalism. Do you have a kind of definition of naturalism? Because I find it personally quite hard to define. But how do you think about what it means for something to be naturalistic?
Usually, it's considered to consist of two aspects, at least on David Papineau's thinking, that there is this metaphysical or ontological component, that everything is physical or material, and the methodological component, we should somehow stick to the methodology of science when we want to say something about reality. So that would be naturalism, and I have been struggling with that term as well, but in the context of consciousness, for me it means that there are no properties or aspects of consciousness that are beyond the scope of science. Science can literally model consciousness just like it models this cup, but the model is not modeled. So the point is not like Russellian monism, for example, or Philip Goff says that there are these intrinsic properties, one class of properties, intrinsic properties that consist our, like, what it's like to be us. Consciousness is intrinsic property, and then there is this other class of properties, extrinsic properties, that science investigates, relational properties like mass, acceleration, and firing rate of neurons, and so on. And it's kind of dualism. David Chalmers, this like author, what is it called? This argument from authority, but he says it explicitly that it's like property dualism. But it is, because there are two kinds of properties: extrinsic and intrinsic. So I want to avoid that kind of dualism. So this brings us to monism part, that you only have these properties that science models. There is only one class of properties, and they are all of the same one general kind as our consciousness, or you can also say that they are physical. And science models all these processes, and some of these processes are conscious in this sense that we are conscious, or other mammals. So that's the naturalistic monism, which is really not, it's not a theory of consciousness. It's a theory of how scientific models are related to reality. That there is this kind of, you still have the dualism. You never get rid of dualism as long as you are a living organism with a Markov blanket, because you have the outside and you have the inside. So I think the dualism that led Descartes to substance dualism, and that led Russellians to property dualism, it is in reality dualism between me and you, between me and everything that is not me, because everything that is not me appears to be physical, like spatial, and everything that is this appears like this. And many people say it's like consciousness, but you can use any terms that you find suitable.
Yeah, I would agree with that distinction. And when it comes to naturalism, I think, yeah, for me, I mean, if you think about the supernatural, to me, that it relates to monism in the sense that if there was a supernatural thing, then it wouldn't fit in with the rest of our description of the world. You know, yes. If there's a God that's outside the laws of physics, then there's a split there. But if the world is just made of one thing, so to me, naturalism is kind of inherently monistic. And it, as you say, it's kind of, I would say maybe it's intelligible in the sense that it can be broadly made sense of using science. We can measure it and make sense of it. Yeah, because I think when we say something, I think you said, you know, in the naturalistic view, everything's made of matter or you know, the stuff of physics. And if you're someone who mistakes the map for the territory, then you could say, oh, you think everything's made of atoms or whatever it is. But I think we probably both share a sense of the stuff that we call matter, the stuff that we call physical, is I mean, I would say it's the thing in itself in the sense that it's completely unknowable, but it's not some mundane hard stuff that's just like little bricks that make everything up. It's the stuff of reality. And I think maybe in your worldview you might say it's consciousness. You have a it's interesting that you describe yourself as a kind of physicalist or materialist, because I think your position, it seems very similar to Bernardo Kastrup and his position on, he called himself an idealist, where the thing in itself in reality is consciousness. So consciousness is the fundamental thing that reality is made of, and then everything else is description.
Yeah, I should read more of his work. I was recently reading his synopsis on his treatment of Schopenhauer, and I think it strongly resembles how I think. But still, consciousness is just a word. And to say that we somehow really know something about what things in themselves beyond our consciousness are, it is problematic. I can say that it is continuous with my consciousness based on the scientific worldview. Like you said, everything is made of atoms. But to say that it is continuous, it is a really weak claim. It is the same kind of claim that reductive materialism says, that you can dissolve this, like break into parts consciousness, and you have these really simple kinds of atoms, and taking any kind of matter you can make up a conscious mind. So it's a reductive materialist view that like it's all just physical processes. But what is physical? This is physical, this here. But I only know this little slice of the physical, and it's a really complex physical process, probably. Even the simple meditative state is probably a really complex, neuronally speaking. I can say that everything is continuous with this, assuming monism, or the scientific worldview, which is monistic. But to say that everything would be consciousness, it's problematic. I'm happy to consider myself as a panpsychist or even an idealist, but then again, they are just words. Reality in itself is always ineffable. But I don't really know. This is really difficult, because at times I have this irrational, mystical kind of experience that I just feel reality. That this is reality and everything is same as this. And it's like really strong emotionally and intuitively, but I wouldn't say that it rationally shows what reality is made of. And maybe it's not even consciousness wouldn't be the suitable term, because it's so like anthropocentric. It means our kind of consciousness, and probably that of pigs and cows and cats and so on, other mammals. But what about reptiles and mosquitoes and so on? That is already something far away from our kind of consciousness. And when you go to organic molecules and bacteria and down to atoms and so on, then you have something still more different. So to say that it's consciousness is the term applicable there?
Yeah, I mean, I was really glad to hear you say that the stuff that reality is made of itself is always ineffable. It can never be named. And to me, that's a hugely important point. I share your kind of disinterested metaphysics, in the sense that, to me, the idea of, so I think talking about substances, talking about things being made of other things, if I say my blanket is made of wool, that's a very particular, like we live in a particular scale where it makes sense to say that some things are made of other things. They stand in that relationship to each other. But to me, that's a very kind of, as a mammal, that's a useful cognitive module we've evolved. But why should that extend to our understanding of reality? To me, I don't think the substance of, I don't think reality, we even need to talk about reality being made of a substance. I just think our way of thinking is quite parochial, and we shouldn't presume we can even make those kinds of claims. I also think if you're a monist and you say everything is made of X, whatever X is, it's kind of meaningless because language is always relational, right? So I think we share that perspective as well. And so whatever this stuff is that reality is made of. So I thought a place we might differ is that, to me, I feel very strongly that even though I know what it feels like to be this thing in itself, to be a kind of a human organism, I don't want to generalize that to something like atoms or subatomic particles. And it sounds like you were agreeing, because I thought as a panpsychist, you'd think, well, everything has this kind of experience, but it sounds like that's not your position.
It's really difficult because my kind of monism consists of two kinds of mystical aspects. You have the negative mystical aspect that we don't know what matter is in itself, and this comes from Galen Strawson. Like he puts it really, really nicely, elegantly. And then there is the positive mystical aspect of saying that everything is mental or consciousness, or where you infer from your own case to other things. And I think we somehow, well, I personally, I feel that everything is continuous with consciousness, and I somehow feel like I know what reality is made of. And this sounds, when I say it, it sounds ridiculous. How could I? I cannot possibly, but still, it's this kind of emotion that you might say that it's religious, and I'm happy with that term. It's kind of dogmatic, but it's not at all dogmatic actually, because I don't believe it just because someone says or anything like that. It's how I experience existence. I experience that everything is this one single totality, and sometimes I entertain these ways how I could formulate this conceptually. Like it would then be this perennial philosophy, like William James's transmissive theory of consciousness, this prism metaphor that matter in itself is like white light, and when it takes the forms of our brains and bodies, it is reduced to this kind of consciousness. Or there are other kinds of ways to formulate this one idea, which is really like not rational, is to it's just a feeling. When I meditate and I'm somehow in this kind of empty state of pure existence, pure being, that I feel like this is what everything is ultimately like made of. And this is the raw material, or like Aristotelian hylos, that they takes different forms. And just a side note, but Peter Sjöstedt had a great lecture on philosophy of psychedelics conference, where he was talking about Spinoza's amor dei intellectualis, like this intellectual love of God. And he was talking about this 5-MeO DMT experience, where you lose sense of time and space, and it's he said that it's not really even, you cannot even call it experience. And I think it might be, I don't know what kind of state that is, but somehow in Spinoza's philosophy, it might, this kind of intuitive state might give us insight of what reality is in itself beyond this my own limited existence. But these are like religious or irrational ideas. I like them and they are meaningful to myself. They are important to my worldview, but they are, I cannot philosophically justify it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like I think it's important to split, as you said, the kind of the claims that are negative in the sense of negation versus the claims that are positive in terms of asserting things are a certain way. So for me, I'm very hesitant around the positive claims of saying I know what reality is made of, or especially a statement like reality is made of consciousness. That's when I feel like, well, now you're coming up with a model, and a model by inherently isn't true. So a phrase that is useful for me is gnosis through negation, in the sense that I feel like I'm navigating the world with this kind of simulation of a world around me. It's kind of I use it to interact with the thing in itself, to interact with the world out there. And it's highly structured. And we normally have this kind of naive realism where we think my perception of the lamp on the table is the lamp on the table. I see through my consciousness. I think this is really what the world looks like. And then in a mystical experience, you can have all that structure. You can see through all those conceptual divisions, and you realize, okay, it's not how I thought. And it's not that you could still just be seeing a simulation, or whatever analogy you want to use. In Plato's cave, you're still just looking at the shadows. But there are certain attributes, like if you notice that the concepts aren't real, that does reflect something about the reality beyond that you're never going to know directly. But because your consciousness it relates to it in some way, you can get insight into its nature. You could say it's a process, it's ungrounded, it's not made of solid categorical static objects. So to me, that's a way where I feel comfortable saying through subjective experience, you can gain insight, but only by tearing down the kind of models that you held onto too strongly, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like maybe that sounds like maybe you the philosopher in you agrees with that you can't really justify the positive ones in the same way as the negative ones.
Yeah, you cannot, and that's why it is so important to keep those two apart. If you consider panpsychism today, which is at least I haven't seen any real this Schopenhauer's or Kastrop's kind of panpsychism is actually different. I don't know how he would formulate the details, but Russellian panpsychism that Philip Goff, for example, represents, it is a metaphysical system. It is a model, and it is really problematic to say that a model ever captures something about things in themselves. What is shared by this Russellian and Schopenhauerian panpsychism is that they are both Kantian. They rest on the premise that we don't know what reality is in itself. And Kant would not have taken the panpsychist route. He denies that we could say anything positive about things in themselves. And the Russellians violate this Kantian basic doctrine of not saying anything of things in themselves. They say that it's all consciousness. And this Schopenhauer, he relied strongly on this Hindu philosophy and Indian philosophy. And I think it's more subtle in that respect, but it's all problematic because it is ineffable. And my own experience that I have, I want to be honest about it, that it's personal. It's not a philosophical theory, really. It's only how I feel. But still, it's not just how I feel. It is also how I think reality is in itself. And this is the paradox of any kind of religion or filling this gap with something positive, the positive part of mysticism. The paradox is that you shouldn't really fill in the gap. You should just be silent in the face of the mystery, but then you just feel so strongly that this is how it is. You get the insight or the intuition. So you somehow get this magical kind of knowledge, or you feel like it, and you have no way to communicate it or even systematize it. And even if you try, you have to admit that it's all just words. And then you get to this point where you just should be silent and drum with your friends.
Yeah.